Good evening. I'd like to call the Committee of the Whole for the Village of Cary for Tuesday, November 5th, 2019 to order with roll call, please.
Weinhammer? Here. Betts?
Here.
Collier?
Here.
McAlpine?
Here.
Cavelli?
Here.
Would you join me in the Pledge of Allegiance, please? I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Now opening up for public comment. Is there anybody that'd like to address the Committee of the Whole before we get going? We'll go ahead and close that at 6:13. We're going to head it off with a discussion of the police pension actuarial projection. Michael, you going to start us off?
In your packet was a little light reading on the police pension actuarial study. Tonight we have Heidi Andorfer here from Foster & Foster, who's just going to kind of lead us through the report and address any questions that the board may have. Heidi?
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to go through our numbers with you and help you understand what we're delivering on an annual basis for you. Hopefully you all have that report in front of you. I'm going to reference a few page numbers in there just to help you. So I'm not just saying numbers to you, you could actually see them in front of you as well. If we look at page 5 of the Foster & Foster report, this is the bottom line on top page, the summary. And here you could see that the recommended contribution on the right-hand side is last year, and the column on the left is this year's numbers. They did go up pretty significantly year over year, about a 20% increase year over year from what we delivered in the prior year. This was primarily driven by assumption changes, and actually I'm going to flip you all the way back to page 14. You could see the itemized changes year over year to see what did increase that. So on page 14, the number at the top is last year's number, the number at the bottom is this year's number, and you can see what the biggest hitters were in terms of what drove this number up. We did implement a couple of assumption changes this year, so that was the biggest driver of this increase. $143,000 of the increase was attributable to those changes. The two changes that were implemented were, one, we did update the mortality assumption. So this assumption is the assumption that's used to determine how long people are going to live in the fund, which ultimately determines the amount of time the annuities are being paid. We updated this to be the public sector table. So in January of 2019, the Society of Actuaries released some tables based on public sector data. These are first of a kind table that's been released. They are custom to this population. So these public tables broke things out by teacher funds, general employees, and public safety. So we are applying the public safety rates to this fund now. Sort of good news and bad news with those tables. The good news is your public safety officers are expected to live longer, but that comes with annuities that are paid longer, higher liabilities, and such. So that was the biggest change that we did implement. The second change that was implemented was that we did reduce the interest rate that we're assuming long-term from 7.25 down to 7. At the 7% rate, I'd still say you're on the high end, especially of a fund of your size. I'd say we'd see most funds at 6.75, 6.5. So this is an assumption that we've sort of been addressing over the last couple of years. It was 7.5 at one point in time. But at 7%, you're now not an outlier. I'd put you on the high end of the range at this point. We would like to see that come down more in the future. Obviously, the lower that assumption is, the higher the liabilities are, the higher the contributions are as well. So we're not trying to change every assumption on you all at one time, but it is something to have on the radar that we do want to consider continuing to look at. Because what happens is if you have too high of a rate of return, in the short term your contributions may be lower, but ultimately the benefits that are promised are what are going to get paid, and you'll see losses to the fund that'll need to be recouped through future contributions. And so you're effectively kicking the can by assuming something too high. So we'd like to get that assumption as in line with reality as possible. If we look back to page 8, page 7. On page 7, that we start getting into our numbers here, and actually I'm going to flip you to page 8. Page 8 actually will show you the funded ratio of the plan. Another important metric to understand. Last year you were at 57% funded. This year, because of the assumption changes specifically, you went down to 55%. Had we not implemented those changes, the funded status of the fund would be improving at 59%. The village has done a good job of trying to contribute the numbers that we're actually providing. A lot of municipalities don't do that, so I always look at that towards the health of the fund. If you're making an effort towards this number, you're ahead of most municipalities already. So that's a good place to be. So your funded ratio is at 55%. That's probably a little bit below average based on what we see in most funds, but you're working directionally towards where you need to get, and the fact that you are contributing is a positive thing, so we like to see that. If I flip you to page 10, a couple other things to point out here in terms of the contribution. This gets you to the details of our contribution calculation and shows you how we got to the $1,069,489 recommendation. Specifically, what I want to point out here is that when we figure out this contribution, the contributors to the contribution are the normal costs in the fund. What the normal cost is what it costs for all of your active police officers to earn a year of service in the pension fund. That's the $599,000 number you see at the top. So that's just what it costs annually for the officers to accrue a benefit. That being said, they do contribute 9.91% of their salary towards that number, which is that $234,000 number that you see near the bottom of that column. So that is an offset to the $599,000. You also have an annual administrative expenses, just the cost of maintaining the fund on an annual basis. In a perfect world, those three numbers would be all you would need to contribute on an annual basis. You take $599 plus $34,000 and subtract the $234. However, there is a large number in the middle, the $669,000 number. What that is the payment to pay down past liabilities. The fact that you're 55% funded means that there's past service that's been earned but not yet paid for. So the service is already accrued, and it basically needs to be paid down like a mortgage. That's what the $669,000 number is. Right now, that's 63% of the contribution at this point in time, and that's based on the funded status. So the fact that you have that unfunded does say that you have to pay something down annually. And that's being paid down over 22 years. It is being paid down using a 4.25% payroll growth assumption. That's another assumption we'd like to see come down ultimately. Again, we're going to try to get there slowly. It was at 4.5 a couple of years ago, so we've brought that down. But what the problem with that assumption is the higher this assumption, the longer it takes to pay down that unfunded. And at this point in time, in fact, the $669,000 is not even paying off the interest that is being earned on that unfunded. So basically, even at this level, your unfunded is going to grow if all of our assumptions come true. So it's an assumption we'd like to also see come down. It does, again, increase the contributions short term. Longer term, it brings the contributions down. So a couple of things to just highlight there is things to keep on the radar. Did you guys have any questions as you review the numbers here, or anything about the increases that happened year over year?
I'm curious as to, with the assumptions, you said that we're a little below the average with our funded ratio at 55. What is the average? What do you think is the average?
It's closer to 60%. So you're not too far off from that. And you would have been really close had we not implemented the assumption changes, but we have implemented these changes for most funds at this point in time.
Okay.
What I'm sorry, did anybody else have any other questions?
No.
The assumption rate, we're at like 7% now, and you're thinking that we should get down to 6.5 ideally?
6.75 or 6.5, somewhere in that range would be more comfortable for a fund of your size.
Other average municipalities like our size, where are they at in their funding?
Probably it's between that 6.5, 6.75, somewhere in that range would be the average. You're definitely on the high end for a fund of this size. And in fact, I would say most of our large funds aren't at 7% anymore. They've dropped down to 6.75.
Okay, very intense reading.
Understood.
I do credit the board for moving that assumed rate of return, though. If you recall, the last couple of years, we were at 7.5
Yes.
and 7.25, and now we're going to go to 7, which is good. We're continuing to move that needle closer to the 6.5, 6.75 area. How long, Heidi? How long do you think we'd have the ability to stay at 7%? And the board's been making some efforts here to move that move that number closer. We've done that over the last few years. Obviously, that has increased the amount that we're putting towards the fund.
It
And two,
does.
but what your forecast on that?
You know, I'd give it a year or two. The problem is we do generally try to collect information from your investment advisors on the fund, and their long-term expectations have been coming down as the interest rate environment's going down. That means any fixed income investments are generally returning less, and on a long-term basis, we're seeing less return anticipated. So the investment advisors have come down about 25 basis points in the last couple of years from what I've seen long-term. And therefore, you know, we'd like to see, assuming continued downward pressure on that, we'd like to see your rate sort of come down to match that.
Do you have a rough idea per quarter percent, how much more of an additional contribution we'd have to make? A rough idea?
I actually have numbers for you at 6.5% if you want to look at those on page 16 of the report. You could see what the impact of the 50 basis point change would be.
That's a big impact.
So the right-hand side shows you what the number is right now, the 1,069,489, and what it would go up to if we drop 50 basis points. If you can extrapolate basically the midpoint of that for 675.
You know, we're talking about, we do a lot in Springfield as well, we're talking about the, you know, with pension reforms and that type going on, with the mandate that they had given us to be almost fully funded by 2040, if that were to change by another, you know, 10 years, what type of relief would that give a municipality, if you don't mind me asking?
So I think it's important to keep in mind that our numbers are not based on the Department of Insurance methodology.
Okay.
We are currently still tying to that end date of 2040. If Springfield were to move that out to 2050, and there has been talk of doing that, we probably would not change our recommended methodology. That being said, we do provide a statutory minimum in this report as well. The Department of Insurance targets 90% by 2040. We're targeting 100%.
100%, right.
Yeah, which is the fiscally responsible way to fund these plans. 90% is arbitrary and.
Right.
and
Well, a lot of that stuff is arbitrary from the state level.
Absolutely.
Just, any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
All
I
right,
appreciate it.
thank you so much for your time.
Can we make a comment, as we did last year, I think, just about what this is and why we have to fund this? This is not a debt that this board created,
Okay, sure.
just for the record. I think last year we noted this piece of the funding obligation that the village board has. And Mike, I think you spoke to it last year as well. This is not a debt that this board of trustees, this elected group created. This is a huge, huge debt obligation that continues from year to year. The funding of the police pension obligations is very important, obviously. It's a critical function of this board, but the debt obligation that you're faced with year to year is a significant obligation to meet and takes up an enormous amount of your budget. So it is to the credit of this board that it is responsible in working hard to meet the obligations that it attempts to do on an annual basis. I don't know if the state makes a similar effort, although they set a lot of the parameters that you're expected to meet as a municipality. So again, this is not, although there is a significant debt obligation here, it's not of this board's making, but this board continues to attempt to address the problem going forward in as responsible a fashion you can.
Thank you for that clarification. All right, moving on to the next item is a discussion regarding the police station Village Hall space needs analysis and a facility evaluation. Eric.
Thank you, Mayor. This evening, we have a discussion that will be led by our architect, FGM Architects. We have Josh Cerniak and his team will be presenting some information on the results of that space needs study and facility assessment that was conducted, looking at a review of a current facility as well as an option and alternative for the committee to consider. If you have any questions, by all means, please feel free to speak up during the presentation, and staff is also here to answer questions as well. I'm going to turn it over to Josh.
Thank you for the introduction. I'll actually quickly introduce the rest of our team. So with me is Ray Lee, who is another principal in our firm, and actually our police planning and programming expert. And then Annabella Orlando, who's a senior associate in our firm and project manager who has been working on the studies with us. And then last but not least, to my left, standing up is Brian Mead, and he is a design principal with our firm. So this evening, we're going to discuss the phase 1 and phase 2 studies that FGM Architects did for the Village of Cary, and so wanted to briefly start with a presentation overview. The entire team is going to speak tonight, so we'll kind of be trading places up here throughout our presentation. As Eric mentioned, please at any time, if you have any questions, feel free to stop us and ask those questions. We'd prefer this to be a discussion rather than a monologue. But also, too, if you want to save any questions to the end, feel free, and we'll entertain those questions at the end as well. So starting off with what our understanding was of the project, or what the studies attempted to uncover. The facility needs of the Village Hall and the police department have certainly changed over the years. And the facility that the Village Hall and Police Department is currently in was not a facility that was purpose designed or built for to serve necessarily as a Village Hall and Police Station. And the original structure dates back to 1925. And over the years, there's been numerous projects that have been done to this facility to form it in some fashion of a facility that does operate as Village Hall and Police Department. But certainly, as I'm sure you've seen in the study, particularly on the Police Department side, there's a lot of functional requirements that we have today in modern policing that, and also requirements per the State of Illinois Administrative Code that the existing PD struggles to keep up with, right? And then on the Village Hall side, there is this idea, certainly more so in this day and age, probably more so than ever, of this idea of representing in your facility, even at a glance, this idea of customer service and transparency. And so one of the things that the study is looking at is what we would have to do or what could be done to modify the existing facility to make that work, to meet the needs of the Village Hall and Police Department well into the future, right? So that's one aspect. And then also looking at not only this facility, but then looking at what a brand new Village Hall and Police Department might look like on the property that's owned by the Village on Industrial Drive. And also, and we don't want this to get buried in with the looking at what we could turn the existing facility into, or what we could do with a new facility on Industrial Drive, but then also the study had to consider what repairs would need to be done at your existing facility if you did nothing. If you essentially, what we like to say with facilities assessments is if that you weren't going to change any functional requirements or programmatic needs, bring the facility back to zero effectively. So through the course of our presentation, and also more detailed in the study, is what we looked at relative to that part. It was something that our team, our architects and the engineers on our team surveyed the facility, and then also considered the reserve study that the Village commissioned last year. So that was also rolled into our study, our phase 2 study on the analysis of the existing facility. Briefly, we did want to talk about the process in which we do the space needs analysis and the facilities assessment, design concepts, and budgets. Those are not done in a vacuum away from the village and police staff. It's a very methodical and iterative process where we are constantly meeting and reviewing the information and then tweaking the information based on feedback that we receive, particularly starting with the phase 1 study, the space needs analysis. There is quite a bit of time spent with our team, or our team spending time with, better said that way, with the village staff and police staff, essentially interviewing them to determine what the current space needs are and what the space needs might be for the future, or at least for the near term. So now I'd like to hand it over to Annabella so that she can discuss the goals and questions that the studies attempted to answer.
So with that, through this fact-finding process and all the information gathering that we've solicited from staff and through analysis of the existing facility, the real intent behind it is really to understand what the operations and really unique specific needs for the Village Hall and Police Department are. So with that in mind, that's essentially the primary goal, the first and foremost that we sought to achieve with the study is understanding what are the space needs that are required in order to achieve a functional building and help facilitate all of the activities that are going to occur within the building and for staff operations. And in addition to that, there's a series of questions that we've sought to understand along the way, namely how, in terms of assessing what are all of the different factors that we have to consider, what are the requirements for if we wanted to maintain this existing building, how can we achieve that? What is required in order to renovate the existing building? In terms of reviewing the other options that are available, what is the best option that the village would consider to pursue? Josh touched upon it a little bit initially, and that namely includes, do we stay in the existing facility and renovate? Do you pursue construction on an alternate site elsewhere and begin afresh? Or identifying what are the repairs and maintenance requirements that would be entailed for just bringing the building back to zero. And then in addition to that, for any concept that was developed, what is it going to cost? What is it going to take to achieve that and get to this point? So in terms of the existing conditions, so as a brief synopsis, the building is a little over 20,000 square feet, and the majority of it is currently occupied by Village Hall functions, and police department to a lesser degree. So the Village Hall is primarily comprised on, with the exception of the boardroom and some ancillary spaces, is predominantly on one level of the building, versus the police department, which is scattered throughout all levels of the facility, lower level, upper level, and a snippet of the first floor as well. So police department operations are significantly more disjointed as compared to Village Hall operations, which is a lot more consolidated right now. So as we met with staff and had a better understanding of day-to-day tasks and what people need in order to function properly, we developed the space needs assessment and determined the space needs for the facility. And this initial analysis and determining the overall square footage that's required for the building is really the foundation upon which the remainder of the study and the remainder of the analysis is built upon. So in comparison to the existing current facility, you'll see there's a little bit of an inverse in the numbers in that Village Hall actually requires a little bit less space than the police department. So as a result of our study, we found that the police department is currently functioning with a bit of a deficiency in terms of space. And we sought to reconcile this a little bit as we developed the concepts that you'll see later on in the presentation.
Taking a stab, working with the chief, making sense of perhaps 4 to 5 officers in case any growth happens, change of policing type efforts, and also 1 to 2 additional non-sworn staff that would support those staff. All of that was actually factored into the study. And when we actually do the study, as Josh mentioned, we're talking to all the various department heads, the various staff, specialized subject matter experts, just to make sure that we get a good idea of everything we need here. Then we bring our knowledge to bear on this whole process. So we're not like waiters and saying, how many offices do you need? We spent a lot of time talking about it. Can we work this way? Can we work that way? Modern policing does this, village halls do this now. So we're bringing a lot of knowledge to the table to help assist and make sure that we're doing the right thing. Again, ultimately it comes down to the village's choice. It's our job to bring you the different options that exist. So let's start there, okay? But the space, we have changes in operations. Over the years, many things have changed, even the way you work. On the village side, again, I mentioned you used outsourced employees, you do a lot of different things different. On the police side, things happen. Like in 2003, the state statutes changed that we have evidentiary retention laws that greatly increased retention schedules. 25, 50, forever. And for evidence they have to keep forever, that's a long time. So we have to accommodate for that. Inadequate use of space for key spaces. These are functional changes that happen over time. And we'll discuss a few of those later on, and I just wanted to point that out. Missing spaces. A good example of this would be when the police department moved in here, probably the term cybercrime was almost unheard of. You hear it every day now. So that's an example of something like a missing functional area. It just wasn't included because we didn't know about that then. Other things that happened, like, whoever thought like the police department would be responsible for all the social services today too. Things like that happen over time. So we have some areas missing. And then accessibility laws changed a lot. And we just had another recent change. So for those of you who have disabilities, you notice that you've been heard. There's like bathrooms are greater, functional areas to access them are greater. Making sure we can get to like public spaces is of critical importance in any building. So those things all impact space. And to give you an example, like a single user toilet, when I first started in architecture, it was 5 by 5, 25 square feet. Now today, we're almost 60 square feet. So it gives you an idea of the magnitude of some of the changes that have happened over time. So, okay, functional areas. There's a lot of areas that are small and inefficient. Everything from like on the left side is their ID room or where they're actually doing like forensic type work for latent fingerprints. It's not exactly what you see on CSI by any means. They took over a closet and they're trying to do it there. Investigations, it's just cramped, and investigations has changed over time too, where over the years, they spend more and more time working on computers and doing phone work and things like that versus being out in the field. So all of a sudden, if you have more than one person in there on the phone at a time, it gets kind of loud and it makes working on different cases more difficult. Roll call and report writing are shared spaces. So as you have shifts coming on and have shifts going off, they're all kind of shared. It just makes things a little bit less efficient as you're trying to, there's like distractions coming in and going off. The good thing about it is that you have those conversations from different shifts happening. So there's a lot of good communication type things, but the bad thing about it is someone's working on a critical report and they're trying to get out of there and all these people are coming and go, how you doing? It's distracting. So lockup. Lockup is actually considered a major corridor in your building. you have to pass through it to get from patrol areas to other areas of the building. And if you actually have someone in there, that makes things even more difficult because you're not supposed to take weapons into a lockup area when people are in incarceration. So, getting from one side of the building to the other, it just makes things a little more difficult. Booking and detainee processing, officers are responsible for the safety of the people they bring in for the process, the detainees. If you look at the size of that room and there's benches in there, a lot of hard surfaces, corners, if someone, I'll just say, freaks out in there, does an officer have enough space to maneuver and take the person down to the floor safely to kind of contain him? In this case, there's a lot of stuff in the way. You have to be careful because that's liability to the village. Interview rooms. We don't see interview rooms that are also combination interview and storage rooms because when you're interviewing people, you don't want them to have access to your stuff. The Sally Port on the other side, this is where they're actually bringing prisoners in. And so think about that. Most modern Sally Ports, we want to keep these spaces really clean. We don't want to have a lot of makeshift weapons or other things that people can get a hold of. You can take a look at here and what are we doing here? So, some of the functional areas that we're doing. Officers are required to carry much more equipment than ever. So we provide them more storage now. So like duty bag lockers to keep their duty bags so they don't just try to shove them in their lockers or anything like that are very common, have been since probably early 2000s. Training rooms. Access to training spaces are really important. The state and federal mandates that have come out for all the different kinds of training that officers have to do is just critical. So this is also very useful. It can be a shared space such as this, but it needs to be a little more conducive for training. So take a look at the locker rooms. It's just, they're tight spaces. They're just small, period. Everything for accessibility from door swings to the stairs heading up to the deputy chief's offices are not accessible. The toilets aren't accessible. Those are things all need a lot more space. Don't want me. I'll hit these two. There's a lot of deficiencies with the existing building, and some of these happen over time. I'm not saying that it's like it's the building's old. It's been around since 1925, parts of it. So things happen sometimes, and they need to be fixed. You had in your reserve study, you had the great room studied, you had mechanical room system studied. Talking to a lot of your staff, everyone brings up how uncomfortable the building is at different times of the year. It is, when you take a look at job satisfaction, being somewhat comfortable in your own work environment is among top things that people want. So when you look at what was actually in the reserve study, and we'll touch about that a little bit later, they were talking more about just straight unit replacements, not necessarily fixing the issues. So in other words, you're just putting a new unit to keep continuing the uncomfortable nature of this building longer. That's what's in the reserve study. So anyways, that's kind of the overview on some of the issues that we have here and some of the space issues. Tried to keep it brief. There's a lot in the report. If you go through there, if you have any questions, we are more than willing to answer them. But I'd like to talk about, bring Brian up to talk about some of the concept type work, because the concepts are critical for helping us figure out what's the best thing to do, what are the different costs, what are the options that are truly available to the village.
All right, thank you, Ray. So it's a perfect segue to go from the trends and the deficiencies into what the concepts were. So I'm going to be brief as well. You have the packet with the pros and cons. I'm going to quickly summarize the pros and cons so we can see kind of the differences of some of the layouts and adjacencies. So if I were to summarize the existing, I think one of the biggest pros, I think, is absolutely the history, the character of this building. I think I'm a huge fan of history. I loved learning about the story of this project. I think you should all be reassured that the FGM design team did the utmost due diligence in really trying to be as creative as possible to get, two viable concepts for you. So I think the strongest thing is you are never going to, the character behind this building and the craftsmanship, you're never going to get in today's dollars. So no matter where we go, you're not going to get that sort of history. So I think that's one of the strongest things, obviously, about your current site. Functionality, all of that stuff, I think we improved, or we have solved in both schemes. But I think the number one pro is definitely the history and the story of this unique building and site. The cons, it is a challenge. I won't beat around the bush. I think just to summarize these, the two biggest cons, I think, is just the inability to get the efficiency. So you can see probably through the packet, you have two schemes presented before you that have about a 6,000 square foot difference. So 26,000 with this site, even though we were super creative, you have these beautiful rooms like the great room, but just the size of them, the way to get to them, it's completely not as efficient as if you were starting from scratch. So I think the size difference, 6,000 square foot delta, is probably one of the biggest cons. And the other con, no matter how creative we got with this site, is parking. Even though you have some of the shared ability with the pool, as Ray was mentioning with the trends, one of the biggest national trends for municipal buildings is secure, safe staff parking. So mainly for police, but we do a lot of combined facilities, and it's so important to protect all of your staff, police and village staff. So the program to try to get 48 secured staff parking spaces, we absolutely got that solved with the industrial site drive. With this site, it's a bit more of a challenge. We were trying to get creative, and the one-way loop that you have today, we were trying to get creative and do a two-way parking on the west, and then try to secure about 16 spots on the south. So we were able to get maybe a third of the secured staff parking, but that's, in our opinion, not enough. You're going to spend this good money on a state-of-the-art facility. You want to protect your staff. So we think those are probably two of the biggest cons. The other cons, I don't really want to dwell on, but the access being more in a neighborhood, lobbies are separated. You'll see the efficiencies in the new site, whereas this site, we still had to keep two separate lobbies. So there's redundancies in lobbies, public restrooms, so on and so forth. Obviously, I mentioned this, less compact, not as energy efficient, even though we would try to improve the insulation and some of the envelope conditions. It's nothing like starting from scratch with a new building. I mentioned parking and the safety issues. So with that, just some quick summary of the two site options. Again, the facts, you're 6,000 square feet over, not as much parking, quite a challenge. The inside, again, you've seen all these graphics. I'll just go quickly through these. These are color-coded by renovation versus addition, because it is tricky with all the level changes, as Ray and Annabella were saying. We tried very carefully to see how much of this we could renovate and where do we do very delicate sort of surgery, if you will, on this building. So how do we do selective demolition? And so you can barely see in this graphic, but we have a dashed red line, which shows part of the police and that very awkward Sally Port photo that Ray showed, how that would be demolished. And we would surgically sort of insert the most efficient two-story addition that we could. But again, we're straddling right against the pool. We're trying to keep a 10-foot buffer from that. But I think, again, to speak on behalf of the design team, I think we came up with a pretty functional layout, probably even more successful with the existing than I thought we could. But you can see all the different circulation. To get to those different historic spaces on the west side, the great room, the middle wing, and then finally the far southwest wing, you have a whole circulation hallway to get to all those. And so there's a lot more circulation. But this is just new versus renovation. The basement's the same. As Ray said, right now, right behind us, we get into some police kind of evidence storage. So there's a lot of sort of crossovers, not as clean demarcation between secured police and secured village. This, again, with the addition in yellow, tries to give a really secured separation. But again, this lower level, even though we propose kind of rotating the council chambers that way, not have this column issue, you still have these extra spaces, so there's a hallway that would get all the way to the exit stair. Because the council chambers is in the lower level, whereas the new scheme, you're going to see it right in the middle of the first floor, you have to, ideally, you want restrooms near a big space. So we'd have restrooms down here, other things that we don't have in the main scheme. So quickly, again, you have these graphics, but we color-coded each option in 4 colors. Public access areas that public can easily get to. In today's municipal buildings, we pretty much try to minimize the yellow colors that you see. I mean, that's very important to minimize public wandering throughout these public buildings. So anytime we can get the yellow as small and less as possible, that's good. Sharing is key too. I mean, we want to make sure that you have the spaces you need, but we want to do more with less. So anytime we can do shared spaces, shared meeting rooms like the great room, how could that be shared? Could there be shared staff restrooms, shared staff break areas? That's all the orange spaces. And then the blue and the purple are your purely separated kind of secured functions for village and police. So that just shows the diagramming. This one was challenging because of the grade change towards the south. The police is sort of a staggered half floor, so it's kind of challenging the way the stairs and the elevator works as well. But that aside, I think we did as good as we could to get this really good adjacency diagram with the existing site. The lower level, again, we tried to keep all the shared spaces here on the north end, and then the police addition on the south would be a much safer Sally Port booking and holding evidence where you don't have that crazy ramp or stair, but you have a nice, safe, flat movement for all of that activity. And then the other 2 things that you're going to see in both schemes is public access and police, besides records or a public lobby or interviews, bond out and potentially property return. You often want to have pretty accessible to the public parking space or lot. You don't want to have people bonded out back, where the police sally port is, where they can't really easily get to it. So in both schemes, like in this one, you'll see right by the pool, there's a door that would get you to property return and bond out. And then you'd walk north back to the north parking lot, and that's how you would do that. So the new site, the pros, the biggest pros, I think is just more efficiency. Again, we're almost, what's interesting, we're almost the exact same square footage as this building here. I think we're only a couple hundred square feet over. But you get much more efficiency, you get more program space for workstations, for council chambers, but where you're saving that square footage is less common hallway space, less redundancies in bathrooms and other things like that. So I think you're seeing in the industrial drive solution just a much more efficient way to organize space when you have the ability to do new. Site access is good, 2 ways in and out. You don't have any of these one-way loops. I think, again, functionality, the size, and parking. So the efficient size and the ability to get all the parking, the secured parking and public parking are the 2 biggest pros, but there's others as well. Some of the cons, again, I mean, there's no way you can compete with the beautiful craftsmanship of this building on the west side and the history. So that we saw as a con. And then, obviously having to find hopefully a user, a buyer for this building gives you a little bit of a challenge. But again, this option 2 provides a much easier phasing plan where you can move pretty much, finish up here when the building is ready and opened. You take a weekend, move all your staff over. So that's one of the other big differences that I didn't mention in concept 1 is any municipality we've worked with in the past that tries this tricky phased approach. You've got to either do a crazy phasing where people are disrupted for a year to 18 months, or you have to spend the money in finding another temporary location in the village for where to move them. And that's added moving costs. It's a lot more complicated. So I think phasing is a big difference between the 2. The site plan, I think is pretty efficient. I know we've had a great feedback from all of your staff, Eric and Jake and the staff, for at least 3 rounds. And again, I just want to remind everyone, this is just a concept plan. So any of these that we would move forward with, there would be a lot more good review of both planning and exterior design. But we think this is a great start. You have an efficient site layout that has plenty of room for expansion. If and when you were to expand, you could expand to the west or east. Because this is about a 15-foot grade drop from Industrial Drive to the north to the south, right away our design team thought this lended itself to a really nice two-story scheme kind of embedded into that hillside. And even the stacking and the programming of it lends itself to that, where most of the first floor is village with the nice public entry to the north. And the lower level, the more secured police floor, opens kind of like a walkout basement directly to the south. So you get nice natural light and good separation at the same time. So all the staff parking would be separated and secured on the south. The public parking, I think there's lots of options. You could do phased approach where you get a certain amount to start with. You could do street parking that was talked about, to have some street parking. Drive connections from the top of the hill to the bottom. Those could be future opportunities. We kind of dash those in, but a lot of just straightforward opportunities for the site. In terms of the color coding, again, you can see how efficient we've gotten this. So unlike this project where you just have to keep two separated entries, police to the south, village to the north, when you start new, you can really rethink everything. And by having one common municipal building entry, you can see how right away you come in and you make your decision whether you're going to the left or the right, police or village hall. You're able to get efficient lobbies, shared public restrooms, a shared boardroom/training room that has really three important access: a public access from the north, secured access points from the south, so that whether you're village staff or police staff, you can all reach this very centralized, very multi-purpose space. All of the orange on the bottom, we think is a really interesting start to this concept, where whether you're police staff coming from the east or from downstairs or village staff from the west, you almost come into the shared staff suite, which is very interesting. So instead of having two separate, staff restrooms or, this space with elevator, stair, executive boardroom, which can double as planning and development boardroom, or even police for that matter, because it's in that secured zone, is very functional. Our new buildings get into a lot of access controls, key card access, where no longer do you have real keys. So, at any given time, you can change employee access to different areas. So when you do a design like this, village staff and police staff can almost all have access to these middle orange areas, which make it very easy to use that. But police staff cannot go further west, or likewise, village staff couldn't go further east. So it's very efficient. In terms of asking, well, why can't village all be on first floor, police all on second floor? There are some public activities that do happen, like coming in to file a report or records, and some things do have that public need, that public face. So we put police records and police administration on the first floor just to give that the most kind of public face. And of course, all your village functions are pretty much on the first floor. And then the lower level, as you can see, is pretty much all police. So it's patrol, it's investigations, booking, property storage and processing, and all your locker rooms. The only orange you're seeing is that kind of middle stacked shared zone. So if all staff park in the back, whether you're village or police, you come right in kind of a shared entry, and then you can quickly either go straight ahead if you're patrol staff, or you go in that shared elevator stair upstairs for village. So very beginning, or very efficient beginning to a Part T, and then shared mechanical. And then bond out and property return is that far northeast corner, and that's a way for people in the public parking lot to take a stair or a ramp down to get to that public access area. So those are the quick highlights of that. And I think the last section, I'll turn it back over to Josh for budgets and what the price difference might be.
And now the fun part, how much does it all cost? So
That's why Mike's leaving.
as I said during the introduction or at the beginning of the presentation, what we didn't want to have buried in all of this was, if the village were to not move forward with a major renovation addition project here or a new facility at Industrial Drive, what would it cost to make the necessary repairs here at the existing facility? And so this is a summary of the preliminary budget for the existing facility repairs. That there's a lot more detail in the final draft report, which you all have a copy of. But what's worth noting is that almost all of the repairs that would occur for the existing portion of the facility that would remain in Concept 1, those costs are rolled into the preliminary budget for Concept 1. And then also it's important to note that, and Ray touched on this, given the age of the facility, that's really what is driving some of the more significant costs that you have. By way of example, the roofing, so the various roofing systems that you have on the existing facility, that totals up, you probably noticed that totals up to a large dollar amount. And then some other exterior envelope items like the tuck pointing of the masonry. In addition to that, site paving costs, the repair to the structural system, and other repairs necessary in the great room. And then the cost to essentially redo the electrical system and put in a new HVAC system. So what our study did, beyond what Ray mentioned was identified in the reserve study, is to really improve some of those systems so that you weren't doing a one-for-one replacement that then ultimately didn't really address things like occupant thermal comfort related to the HVAC system. So. And also too, before we move on to the other budgets, I should mention that the numbers that are represented, not only in the summary that we're providing, but also in the report, represent total project budgets. So what that means is that within the budget, we've identified hard construction costs, contingencies, and then owner soft cost. And you may be, if you've not gone through a brick and mortar project like these before, you may be saying, well, what are owner soft costs? And really those are indirect costs that are attributed to paying, first and foremost, a shameless plug for architects, but paying your architects and engineers, and then outfitting your building with furniture, fixtures, and equipment, paying for geotechnical investigation of the site, land surveying, et cetera. So all of that is in detail in the budgets that we provided in the study. So moving to Concept 1, the preliminary budget for that particular concept, which again, Concept 1 is the major renovation and addition to your existing facility. Here, and also too, it's worth noting that in all of the budgets, we provided a low and a high end of the budget. And really what we're trying to do, we believe all good estimates should provide that information, because there's a lot of variables that are outside of your architect and engineer's control, also outside of your control. So market conditions play a big factor into when you actually do the project, and when you go out to bid, the village could have very favorable bidding conditions, which might represent more of the low end of the budgets, or you could have a bidding environment where there is less competition, or things like rising material costs or labor shortages in the Chicagoland area cause an increase in those costs, and that's kind of more representative of the high end of the budget that we've provided in all those scenarios. So Brian spoke about the inefficiencies in doing the major renovation addition project here at the existing site, And so what does that mean in terms of dollar cost? Well, that's represented by this budget. So certainly because of the additional square footage that's needed here to make this particular building work the way that the village would want it to, there's higher cost associated with that. So literally because there's larger areas to renovate and construct, that is ultimately reflected in the higher budget numbers that you're seeing for this particular concept. And then if we go to concept 2, summary for that preliminary budget, because as we spoke about, there's greater efficiency there. There's ultimately a lower cost to construct that particular option. So last but not least, we always make a professional recommendation on what, having gone through this particular study and developing all of the information and the concepts and the budgets, it's FGM's recommendation that the village pursue a new combined facility on Industrial Drive for all of the reasons that we mentioned, not only in the presentation tonight, but that are laid out in more detail in the study, or the final report, I should say, that we provided. And certainly the recommendation includes all of these things that are identified on this last slide. But from I suppose another way to look at our recommendation, and this was touched on a little bit earlier in our presentation, is the other thing that's identified in the budget for the existing facility, and it's a large cost, is to temporarily move Village Hall and police operations to a site that you're going to have to invest a significant amount of money into making that work for the time period that you would be doing the construction work here, and the village and the community never gets that money back. So with that, certainly, first and foremost, thank you for your time, and we'd love to answer any questions if you have any.
Anybody have any comments or questions regarding this?
Sure. First of all, you guys thank you for taking the time to explain all the different concepts to us, because I think all of us as a board, we obviously need to weigh out all the different options to figure out what's the best way to be good stewards of the taxpayers' money. I will go on the record and say I agree with the recommendation that we need to go to industrial, simply because the cost to keep putting money into here and the inefficiencies, I don't think we'll ever get to that level. I'm excited about the starting point. I think that there's questions, and I know that I can get a little ahead of myself and want to get into different elevations and site design. I know we're not there.
Sure.
But I think there are some concerns that I've had that I relayed about storage. I want to make sure that we have enough storage. I know that sounds really silly, but I don't want to have to build something new and not have enough storage, and we've got to do our different evidence storage or anything like that off-site, because that defeats the purpose to me. I just happened, when I happened to be in here, the chief happened to walk in, so I kind of roped him in and wanted to get his opinion, because I feel that the police is the biggest footprint that we have.
Sure.
And I think that's very important. I definitely want to look at something, a carport or something like that, that's not, I don't think, in here at this point. I know you gave us some numbers for it, but I have some concerns that as a municipality, we no longer have a source of funding for our fleet. So I want to see what we can do to extend the term of keeping those as in good of a shape as possible. I don't know that we can do a parking structure per se, but maybe something of that nature. I don't know if I'm giving you proper feedback here of what you're looking for, but I just think that you guys did a very thorough evaluation. I appreciate that you went out and talked to the staff, both police and village staff, to come up with the good needs analysis, because I think that's very important. I know that I've spoken with some other board members, and we've had some concern about that. We'll go with Kim, if I'm saying it's the ivory tower effect, kind of having one level here for police and one level here. And I don't know if that's something that you're seeing on a regular basis. You know, we want to make sure that we have synergy within the team. And maybe that's achieved by now having space where they can have common space to do training and different things like that. But those are some of the little concerns that, you know, that I just thought we could chit chat a little bit about and see what your thoughts are. What are you seeing out there? And is this typical, or where are we with some of this?
So
I know it's a lot of comments
Yeah.
there, so.
Well, first,
What we're
thank
here
you.
for.
And the feedback is fantastic. If the village elects to move forward with either option, well, really any three options, but primarily concept one or concept two. So if concept one, you were to stay here and do a significant investment in the current facility, or if you were to move to Industrial Drive, if the village then decided to move into phase 3, which would essentially allow us to do all of the necessary documents to get the project to a point where it was able to be bid and also permitted. The very first phase in phase 3 is schematic design. And within that particular design phase, we would work with the village to essentially come up with multiple options to address some of those, well, I shouldn't say it that way, all of those things that you brought forward, and couple that with budgets so that it would allow the village board to make it a more informed decision on how exactly they wanted to move forward. Because certainly some of the things that you brought up would increase the cost. If you were to compare it to the preliminary budget for Industrial Drive, or if you were looking to try to even do some of those same things here at the existing site. So now I would like to have Ray and possibly Brian address the question related to the separation, you know, as you saw, separating between floors, the PD, and then even the interaction with Village Hall side.
Sure.
Eric, can you help him go back to that slide just so that we can see that?
You asked about some of the things we're seeing in communication, and
Thank you.
especially in the police side of things, because right now we have the administrative staff, command staff on one level, which in one sense they're the most public face of the police department. And a lot of all the investigations and the workers, everything else down. What we're seeing in police stations now is really trying to figure out ways to increase communication throughout the department. We try not to go in, especially for municipal departments, more than 2 or 3 levels max, just because it gets harder.
Right.
But we also look at creating various points within the whole facility where we can have informal interaction, where people can bump into each other and have those discussions and not be hidden. So during the design process, we look for ways of how can we make it comfortable for an officer to come up and see the administration, and vice versa. How can we make it easy for administration to go down and do the management by walking around and see what's going on down there too? It's purposeful, purpose designed that way. I think Brian will attest he does that all the time, you know, and it is really important in modern policing, especially if you look at the workers that are coming today. The younger police officers are demanding that. They want attention. They want to be able to talk to people face to face. Just like when you think about roll call rooms, you know, Hill Street Blues, be safe out there, right? They're all lined up in front. If you look at what we're doing today, it's more of a conference setting. And they want to see around a table, they want to look at their commander officers, you know, and see, you know, who's the officer in charge for that day, or in this case, you know, it could be their sergeants or whatever. And they want to see them and talk to them like one-on-one. So we're trying to accommodate that in our designs, and that is very good point that you made about, you know, how do we do this? But it is done through the architecture. So, evidence storage. To size that, what we did was we took a look at evidence intake versus evidence destroyed on an annual basis. We kind of did it over a period of talking to your property custodians here over a longer period of time. I think we looked at give us an idea over 5 years. What are you taking in? What are you destroying? So then we have a net growth number per year. Then we multiplied that by 30 to come up with our number to give us 30 years. You know, it's a number.
Sure.
It's a nice number to pick, you know, and say, let's use that. So that's how we size some of those spaces. And as more is becoming like especially like the reporting and things like that and other things becomes more digitized, you know, we're hoping to see reductions in need for like paper storage too. So Eric would love to see that, you know, because he's got a lot of storage over at Public Works in that picture. So then no.
So I wanted to come across, first of all, I'm very excited about what you did. I don't want it to, I'm just saying those are some things questions that I have, but
Yes.
I personally think we should, I would like to move to the next phase.
Yeah, and just one quick comment about like covered or indoor parking.
Right.
Both have benefits for prolonging life for vehicles. We've seen people with like carports increase the vehicle retention schedule by a year, sometimes 2. And indoor parking especially, it's like a no-brainer. They pretty much do 2 years extension to their retention schedules automatically almost. So there is validity to that. But again, you have to weigh that versus the cost.
Right. I can sometimes have champagne taste on a beer budget, as I like to say, so.
Yes.
This is I just want to remind the village board too, it's a strong concept.
Yep. I know.
This is by no means a final plan, as you heard. There's a lot more work that if we decide to go into the phase 3 that would need to be done. You know, we started with the space needs to figure out how much space we would actually need for this facility. Looked at our existing site and the industrial drive site to decide what might make the most sense for us from a long-term perspective. So this information here is to help us decide if we want to go through to that phase 3 option or not.
Questions from this side?
No, I think the new site probably makes the most sense. I just would be a strong advocate that administration would be with its police staff. I feel very strongly about that.
We've heard that sometimes.
But even, and I don't know, I'm no means an architect, but like some of the IT stuff that you have down here, I don't know if it's possible to maybe move that up to that like corner area. I just know as a police administrator, sometimes, you know, you spend a good chunk of time in your office and sometimes it's just by happenstance, somebody's walking past you and that you get that chance to interact with them, that if you're stuck in a corner in a completely different building or a completely different level of a building, you just may not have that opportunity. I agree with what you said about millennials. I think they do like look for that interaction.
But frankly, we think the best police stations are one story. But we have this big slope on this site that, what are we going to do?
Those are certainly things that we can look at here in the next phase. Trustee Cavelli, you know, we do have obviously some challenges with the site and
Sure.
budgetarily too as well that impact this, but absolutely all the suggestions that we've had from board members already and what we're hearing tonight, we can look at that in the next step.
Yeah, but I think it's very thoughtful, again, to even looking for moving forward, just some of the spaces that I think you built out for the future. I think that is just, it's very important. And I like that you guys were very thoughtful through that process.
Thank you.
I have a question. When you look at concept 2 here and you have the high and low numbers in here, and then we're talking about different concepts and adding and moving things. In a project like this, what drives up costs the most? Outside look, appearance, or adding square footage?
Yeah, I mean, and so materials
Right.
can, if you came to us and you said you had an unlimited budget, we could certainly spend or help you spend a significant amount of money on making essentially everything gold-plated. Adding square footage, certainly it can be right next to the choices that you make in materials. And depending on the complexity of the building site, or in the case of your existing facility, what you have to work around to make the addition or the renovations, that can have a huge impact on the cost per square foot. Because really, in the preliminary budgets, which you probably saw, that's really in the terms that these budgets were put together in cost per square foot terms.
Chris, did you have any?
I'm in favor of the industrial.
Well, I'm in favor of moving forward with phase 3, of course. You know, we've had internal conversations between trustees and that and staff. You know, we've got our constrictions that we have to work on and to build something that's realistic, that's reflective of where we've been, where we are, and where we want to go. I think some of the questions and some of the comments that I have for this project will be best answered as we move forward. And rather than, spend a lot of time talking about things that we don't really know yet, I'd like to kind of hold off on that for right now. But I think it's overwhelming to me. I want to put it in, this is a great building we have. I have known this building since I've been in Cary since 1992, and this has been where we come. It's a great building. It's a beautiful building, but
Sure.
I would say 90% of the people that come to Village Hall don't see the beauty of the building because they never drive that way. They just see the little round, nondescript entrance. So when you show people, like on our website, it shows this, and I've had other mayors say, like, where is that building? I go, it's Village Hall. No, your Village Hall is got like, yeah. So I get it. And this building does have a lot of great benefits to it. I get that. And the history is there too. But what really drives my thought process is that we need to build something that's purpose-built for us rather than continuously retrofitting. This would be a great facility for somebody else that doesn't need the capabilities that we're looking to have at an affordable price. When you look at opportunities, you're talking about, moving, when I talk to the trustees, we're looking at a 50 to 75-year building. This building won't last another, at the rate we're going right now, and at what point do you start throwing money away? And we have an obligation to our taxpayers to do what we think is best. And what's nice about this, and I've conveyed this to a lot of people, is that we'll be able to do this without a tax increase. It won't affect people's property taxes. And we've been planning for something like this for a while. So it's kind of exciting to see after, I've been involved in village politics here since 2009, and we've talked about it since then. And here we are 10 years later, and things are kind of looking in that direction. But I think a majority of the board is in agreement. From what I've heard here, the whole board here is in agreement to move it to the next phase. So do you have any questions or comments to that, Mr. Wright? No? You have anything to say?
I'm fine. That's good.
Okay, well, I think that we have a consensus to move this forward.
Trustee Weinheimer had any?
She
No,
said no.
No, I met with you guys and spoke
Okay.
about everything, so I'm fine with everything, with moving forward to industrial drive.
Right. So we have a consensus to move us to that next level. We'll have Jake and Scott work on an agreement to get us to that next point.
Yeah, the
But
next step.
thank you very much.
Sorry, the next step here for Village Board's reference would be to hopefully work with FGM to negotiate a contract for that Phase 3 work. For the public's benefit, the village had gone out for a RFQ process, and that's how we landed on FGM. As a part of that process was a Phase 3 option if the board decides to move forward, and that's the direction that we have here this evening. So appreciate that. Appreciate all the time from the village board in reviewing this, and a lot more work in front of us here, and this is just a small step for us. But as the mayor had stated, this has been talked about, contemplated here at the village for a long time. This is not a new concept or a new idea. The village has been saving for this for many years, and it's now time to take some action. So appreciate that.
No other comments? We are not going to have an executive session tonight. Smiles, everybody, smiles. I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
I make that motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
There are no nays.
For the record.
For the record.